So I'm already logged into my Bold BI account, and one thing I want to start off by mentioning is that there are multiple ways to get access to the features of Bold BI essentially. So what I'm using is the cloud version of Bold BI. And so you can see that I'm logged into this domain, myname.boldbi.com. This is how you can identify it as a cloud account. That can be customized, by the way, so you don't have to have the boldbi.com domain in there. There is also an on-premise edition of Bold BI. It allows you to have full control over the hosting of the platform. Now, as far as the feature set and what I'm going to show today, there'll be no difference between the cloud and the on-premise version. And in general, there really aren't any differences in terms of features. It's just mostly about preference and environment and things like security concerns and the like that will determine which edition you go with. So what I'm going to do here is create a dashboard as quickly as I can. But what I'll actually end up doing is explaining things along the way. So I'll actually take my time doing it. But the aim of the webinar here is to give you a good bit of information so that when you get to creating your own dashboards, you already have a good idea of what to do, where to go, what to click on, and hopefully also even have an idea of what you want your webinar or your dashboard to look like. So to get started here, I'm going to click on the blue plus sign, which will give me access to the creation tools. So as far as dashboards are concerned, we can start a couple of different ways. We can start from a template or start from scratch. If we actually use a template, it's possible to create a dashboard in under 30 seconds. It's actually just a few clicks in order to do this. So these are pre-built dashboards where all you have to do is connect your data that it's asking for essentially. So for example, we have a couple of Google Analytics dashboards that you can see here. And so if you click on connect your data, it will actually just ask you to connect to your existing Google Analytics account. And when you do, a fully functional and fully populated dashboard will appear without you having to do anything else. So really quick way to get started, and you still can customize it after the fact, but that is actually the quickest way to get started with any dashboard within Bold BI. But instead, what I'll be doing is creating one from scratch. So I'll go back to this main page and click the Start from Scratch option. So I'll go ahead and give this one a name. I'll just call it Webinar Dashboard. Oops. And go ahead and click Add and Design. So this will bring us right into the Dashboard Designer interface. There are a couple other things that I did beforehand, just in the interest of time. So one of the things that I'm not going to cover in this particular webinar is the process for connecting to a data source. That has actually been covered in previous webinars that we've done, and we also have some tutorial videos on the Syncfusion YouTube page that you can go check out to see more in-depth information about how to connect to data sources and also different data sources that we have support for. So what I have done in my particular dashboard here is I've ahead of time, like I said, created a couple of data sources, and what I will show you is what it looks like after you connect to the data source itself. So I'm actually going to use 3 different data sources for this dashboard, and these you can see them here marked as webinar. So there's webinar marketing details, email, and leads. So essentially, I'm going to be creating a dashboard using marketing data, essentially from pulled from a Google Analytics account. So here we go, Google Analytics, and also some imaginary email campaign as well. Okay, now the interesting thing to note about these different data sources is they're all coming from the same database. So what I've actually done is split off the different tables from that one database into separate data sources so I can easily switch between them when I actually start creating my dashboard. So just to show you what that looks like, this is what you see after you connect to a data source. So really the only thing that I'm skipping here is just a process of entering my credentials necessary to connect to the database. Otherwise, setting this up is really simple. So let me actually remove what I've done here and show you what this is like. So in order to set up a data source, once you've connected to it, all you need to do is, for example, here with a database, find the table that you're looking for. So in this case, it was the email marketing table. Drag it over to the canvas. And then if you want to, you can check the data that's coming through to make sure that you've connected to the correct table. So I'm verifying that this is in fact what I want. And then that's it. Click Save, and you're ready to start creating a dashboard. So as far as connecting to data sources, this as well is a quick process. Obviously, you can go far more in depth with this, and I actually do have a slightly more complicated data source that I'll be using in this particular demo. So this first one here, you'll notice actually has two tables. So I've actually done a join here. But again, I won't go into any detail on that. That is for a different webinar, and we have covered that in the past. So again, check out our YouTube channel if you want to see more information about how to deal with data sources. Okay, so moving on. So next thing I'm going to do is start setting up the dashboard that I'm going to create. So I have an idea of what I want it to look like. So I'm going to go ahead and start placing my dashboard widgets. So I'm going to use a donut chart. I know I'm going to use a card widget. I know I'm also going to use a funnel. I know I'm going to use a combo chart, so I'll drop that in. And I'm right now, as you can tell, I'm just kind of roughly placing these where I want them to appear in the final result. So what I'm going to do now is start to resize and reposition some of these widgets. So missing one here, so I also want to use a gauge. Okay, so now I'm going to resize these. So as you can see, this is also a very quick and simple process. It's just a matter of placing your widgets where you want them, sizing them appropriately, depending on how much data you're visualizing within each one, and also just in general, what you and your users need to see. So I'm actually going to stretch this out a little bit more. And same thing here. And then lastly, I'm going to move this combo chart over and stretch it across the bottom here. Okay, so once you've laid out your dashboard, at this point, you're pretty much ready to start setting it up. And so now it's just a matter of going through each widget and applying some data to them. So I'm going to start with a donut chart. And when you first select a dashboard, you'll notice, or sorry, a widget, you'll notice that there's a blue bounding box around it. This gives you your drag handles for resizing, gives you the ability to then drag and drop it and move it around. But you'll also notice there's a little gear icon in the top right corner of that widget. So this, clicking on that, brings open the properties panel for that particular widget. So sorry, I'm kind of fighting the GoToMeeting toolbar here. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is name this widget. So this was going to be revenue by channel. And since I'm here, the first thing I'm going to do is enable animations, since I already know that I do want to just have a more visual appeal to my dashboard by having animation throughout it. Now, I'm actually going to have to come back to the properties because some of the options that I want to change are actually not yet available. So for example, I have no way of changing the color scheme of this widget until I've actually added some data to it. So once I've added some data, I'll come back and make it look the way I want it to. And so in general, that's what I'll do for most of these widgets. I'll first set them up with data, and then I'll come back and change the colors and things like that. So next up is setting up or applying some data to the widget. And you do that by clicking the Assign Data tab at the top here. So I'll click on that, and this gives me access to all the different fields from my various data sources. So again, I set up 3 different data sources for this particular dashboard, and in order to select between them, we have this drop-down menu in the top right corner of the Assign Data tab. So if I click on this, this gives me access to those 3 different data sources that I set up. So in this case, I'll actually stick with the default one that shows up here, the first one, the marketing details table, because I know that this has my revenue and channel information. So here I have a field called channel name, and I'll use that as my column. And then I have another field here called revenue that I'll use as my value. So once I drag those in, you'll see once the preview updates that it automatically shows me the information that I was looking for. Now, it's not 100% formatted in the way that I need it to be. So again, I'll come back and change that after I've set up the rest of the widgets. So there's different ways and different sort of tactics you can take in order to set up a dashboard. You can do each widget one by one, fully set them up, assign data, and then go through the properties and make them look exactly the way you want. Or you can sort of do what I'm doing, which is to first set up the widgets with data and then come back and worry about the visual aspect of the widgets. So this next one is actually going to be related to our click-throughs. So this was going to be called total clicks by channel. And I'll go ahead and center that title. Let's see, where was that? Oh, it's already centered, so I don't actually have that option here. So this is one of those widgets where it's automatic. So I'm actually going to stick with the same data source in this case, but now I'm going to show clicks by channel. Now, the way this is set up, you'll notice that I actually have this scrolling list because I have multiple channels, and this card widget in its default configuration is intended to show essentially one value at a time, but it is capable of displaying multiple values. So if the way you've sized it, if you sized it the way I have, where it's essentially a single block or single square here, you'll have a scroll bar where you'll be able to go through each of the different values that you're displaying in the widget. But I know that if I stretch it out, I'll actually be able to show most, if not all, of my different channels here. So there's still a little bit of a scroll bar. So what I can do to alleviate that is I can actually make my dashboard a little bit bigger. So I can give myself a few more rows in order to fit the rest of the channels and remove that scroll bar. And then that also allows me a bit more room to stretch out the rest of the widgets. So I can either stretch these out a bit more or, of course, just add additional widgets. In this case, I'm going to choose to stretch these out and just give them a little bit more breathing room. Okay, so this card widget's pretty much done, so I'll move on to the radial gauge here. This widget I'm going to use to display total revenue versus goal. And so there's a couple of ways of handling something like that. So this will be total revenue versus goal. And this one I will center the title, turn on animation, and also I'll go ahead and change the gauge type. So I'll do a half circle. So now when I go over to assign data, I'll be able to, once again, report on the revenue field that I have in my data set, but this time I'm actually just going to show what it is. It's just its value. And so the way that this can be utilized in order to show how close we are to some goal, if you have in your data set a target value, so if you have something that would represent the target value, you can actually bind it to that field in the widget. And the use case for that would be if your goals change over time, if you have to readjust, and that's something that's in your data set, it can automatically update within the gauge itself or within the widget. Now, if that is a hard set value, which it oftentimes is, you can also do it two different ways. You can create an expression column within the data set. So it essentially allows you to just type in a number and set it as a field, and you can essentially hard code a target value that way. Or if I go back to the properties, there's actually a maximum value already set here. So let's pretend that our actual revenue goal is 5.2 million instead of 3.2. So this gives the gauge a little bit more to display. And again, I'll come back and actually modify this gauge a bit to make it a little bit more easier to see and maybe a little bit more visually appealing. So next up, I'm going to set up our funnel here. And this will be our lead funnel. So this one will actually be using a different data set than the previous ones I've just set up. Again, I'll center the title. In this case, there is no animation available, but there is a legend that we can show. So I'll go ahead and set that up. And I'll also turn off show value labels. And I'll come back and show you what that actually does. So, or actually, I can just show you right here. So if I scroll over and then reselect the funnel, the show value labels option allows you to have these indicators essentially that will point directly to each segment within the funnel and show you what it represents. But because I'm using the legend, that's actually redundant. So I'm choosing to turn that off. And also just because of the way I've sized the funnel, those value labels will essentially be cut off. They're not going to really be that useful in this current at the current size that I have. So moving on to assign data. In this case, I'm actually going to change my data source to leads. And now I'm going to start setting up the funnel itself. So I'm going to start by putting in our or essentially our conversions. Now I'm actually going to work this one backwards in order to populate the funnel in the correct order. So then we go to sales qualified leads, sales accepted leads, marketing qualified leads, captured leads, and then finally visitors, which will be our overall set of people that essentially we've captured through our ads and other means of or various channels that we are utilizing for capturing leads. So some of marketing. So then it's captured and then visitors. Now, one thing you'll notice that as I add these fields is the name of the fields actually changes from when I have it here. So you can see this is currently set to visitors. That's the actual name of the field. But if I add it to the funnel, it changes to sum of visitors. So that sum of is just letting you know that some aggregation has been applied to that field. That can be changed. So if I, instead of wanting to see the total number of visitors in this case, I can see the average number of visitors. So if we're filtering this data by date or date range, for example, the average would be very useful, or even just a count of individual records. So you have all these different default aggregation types that you can set to any of your numerical values. And you also can expand this by using the expressions feature that I mentioned earlier. It allows you to create calculated fields. So you can actually create more advanced calculations and different types of aggregations if you'd like. So with regards to the naming of these fields, on the actual widget, as you can see here, it takes the name that was added once it's been added to the value box here. So it actually shows up as sum of one, sum of sales qualified, etc. You can actually change that right from here on the widget configuration screen. So I can change this to, let's say, instead of sum of one, I'll just change it to conversions. And then same thing with the following fields. Now we can do it here, or let's say that for whatever reason you forgot or just didn't do it at that point, you still have a different place where you can do it. You can do it at the data source level so that as it comes over to the widget itself, it's already been renamed to something a bit more user-friendly. Or if you go into the properties, you have the ability to customize the legend from here and deviate from something that maybe someone else set up in the data source. So if someone already set up specific column names in the data source, and then you might be creating a dashboard and it's not the same person that created the data source, and you want to name them something else, you can still override that by coming in here and changing your legend settings. So for example, I'm going to rename this sales qualified, sales accepted, marketing qualified, captured, leads, and then visitors. Okay. So you can see that I've sort of mismatched the way that these were renamed. So if I go back to the legend, that first one shows its original field name of 1, but because I renamed it at the widget level, I don't actually have to do it here in the legend. It still shows as conversions on the legend here. So now my lead funnel is complete, so I can move on to the next widget. So in this case, I'll set up the stacked area chart that I have down here. Now, in this format, it might not be the best use case for it, so I'm actually going to change what I'm going to do with it a little bit. So this is actually going to be used to show email performance. Since I do have an email data source, I'm going to be able to show some email performance data. So I'll go ahead and enable animation. I'll leave the legend on since I do want that. And then again, I'll center the title. I'll move over to assign data, change my data source to webinar email, and then I can start to set this up. So the way I'm going to divide my data in terms of columns is not by campaign name, but rather by date. So I want to see the performance over time, so I'll use the dates of the records as my column. And what I want to show in this email performance is just your standard opens and clicks. You can see here in this data set that we have quite a bit more. We have opens, clicks, unsubscribes, bounces, spam reports, etc. But just to keep things clean and simple, I'll stick with opens and clicks. Now, the first thing you'll notice, very similar to what happens with numerical fields in terms of aggregation, where we have a default of the sum total, we also have a default format for dates. So regardless of your date data, or what kind of date format you have, Bold BI will default to just showing you the year, which is why you see the word year in front of the field name. Now, if you look at my data set, it only spans 2 years, and looking at this type of data on a yearly basis really isn't all that useful. So in order to change that, I can just click on the gear icon next to that field, and then you'll see that I have additional date format options. The first thing to note here is that even though we call the field, even at the data source level, a date field, it is a date time field. So if you have time, a timestamp, it will be displayed and it is supported by Bold BI. So to go further on that, you can actually break down your date related data into the units of time, hours, minutes, and seconds. So pretty powerful way to divide up your data and display things within any of the widgets. So this is actually a setting that you'll find in all widgets, regardless of their type. So in my case, I'm actually going to do this by, let's try by month and see how squished that looks. Okay, so that's not too bad. But let's say, like in my case, I am not able to see all the data. So there's actually data for all 12 months of the year. So it actually spans from, actually it's 14 months worth of data. So January of 2019 all the way up to the current month, February 2020, is what I have in my data set. And clearly I am not showing that in this particular widget. So another way I can represent it is by quarter. And this might make a little bit more sense given the size of this particular widget. So now we can see a better representation of our email performance over time. Okay, and that pretty much covers that widget. So next up, the last one is this combo chart. So a combo chart is useful when you want to overlay two different pieces of information in a single widget. Now, it is possible to do that in other widgets. For example, all of them support trend lines as well, but it's not the same thing as actually showing two different data sets or two different sets of data in the same widget. So what I'll use this one for is to show the difference between or the relationship rather between our conversions and our ad cost. So we can correlate how much we're spending on ads and how much we're bringing in terms of converted customers. So again, I will enable animation. I'll leave the legend on and I'll center my title. Then I'll go over to assign data. And this one, yep. So this is sticks with our default marketing details table. So what I'll do here is I will divide this up by channel name. So each of my channels, I'll be able to see how the, oops, wrong place. I'll be able to see how the cost compares to the, not the revenue, but rather, the converted leads. So we could do it by cost versus revenue, but in this case, I'm choosing to do conversions versus cost. So channel name is going to be my column, and that'll divide up my data. And then I can put in add cost as my secondary value. In the combo chart, the secondary value corresponds to the line graph that's shown. So you can see that as the line. And then I'll do my my ones, or my conversions, as my main value, and that will be the column chart. You can see that the two different y-axes automatically scale based on the data that you put in there, so there's no need to worry about the scaling of that. It's handled automatically for you. And at this point, this is also complete. Now, there are a couple of other things that we can do to customize how much data is actually displayed in any given widget and how it's displayed. So again, coming back to the example on the left side here of the dashboard, this widget is kind of squished over here in the corner. So I had to show data on a quarter by quarter basis as opposed to, let's say, by month. There's just too much data to show there, and I didn't want to have a scroll bar. But let's say that my data wasn't so easily filtered that way. So let's say it wasn't a date that I was able to just select and have it automatically divided up into quarters. Let's say it was something else, as maybe you have a string field that you are using as the basis for that axis, and therefore you can't just select an easy way to filter it. You still can, actually. So if I go back into the configuration of, actually I'll go into this one. I'll go into this donut chart here. So what I can do is for the donut chart, let's pretend that I have far more channels in this, and they were all my segments are too tiny to really be useful, and I want to pare that back. You can actually apply quite a few different types of filtering to all of your fields. So in this case, I'm going to choose the channel name, which is what corresponds to the categories here. Click the gear icon, and then choose filtering. So you can see here that some filtering has automatically been applied, and that's because there is quite a bit of data in here, or there can be rather. So sometimes the system will automatically apply a special type of filtering called ranking in order to make sure that what you see in the widget is useful and not overly crowded. So here, ranking allows you to essentially choose the top or bottom most records or least records that you have in your data set. So in this case, for example, the top 5 channels that have the most revenue being reported. I can, of course, change this to say top 10. I'm not sure if we actually have 10 different channels, but I can increase that number. We might see a change here. Okay, yeah, so we have a couple of more that are now popping up. But one thing you'll notice, the way this particular data set is set up, or the way the sample data was recorded, most of these channels actually have a pretty uniform or pretty similar set of revenue. So the donut actually ends up being pretty uniform. So not the best representation of this kind of data, but you kind of get the idea. So another thing you can do with filtering is, of course, in addition to ranking or in place of ranking, you can just apply a condition. And you can choose any of the fields in your data set for this. So let's say that I wanted to do this by lead. So instead, let's say that I only want to see the channels that had the most revenue, but also were the ones that provided, let's say, at least X number of leads. And so I can say, greater than or equal to, and then some value here. So let's say that we only care about the ones that had good revenue and also provided at least 1,000 leads. So utilizing these filters, you can do that. And again, set up your widgets to show the most relevant data at a glance, so without you having to do anything else. Now, these filters can also be modified by the end user. So let's say that, so I'm actually not going to use either of these. Turn those off and just let it do what it wants to do. Let's say that I want my end user to have control over what they see in the dashboard. So what we can do with that is give them some user filters. So I'm going to make some space here. I'm just going to resize this card widget and bring back that scroll bar. And then what I can do in that empty space is add some combo boxes. So here we can provide some filters. And actually, this probably look better at the top. So let me actually reposition this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this card widget down and then make some space at the top for these filters. Let's just start with one for now, so I'll go ahead and resize this. So you can have as many filters on the dashboard as you'd like. And as you saw earlier, if you need more space, you can give yourself more space by adding more rows to the dashboard. Adding more rows beyond the default creates a scrolling dashboard. So if you don't change this setting, which I believe the default was 6, when you publish your dashboard and make it live on any desktop or full-size tablet device, your dashboard will fill the screen without any scroll bars. Scroll bars will only appear if you're looking at the dashboards on a smaller device like a phone, and then it'll automatically scale down to a single column view, and then you'll have automatic scroll bars. But if you change this setting on a desktop or a full-size tablet device, you'll be able to give yourself a scrolling dashboard experience in order to have more data visible on the screen. So it gives you quite a few options in order for you to be able to decide how you want to display your data. This is also really useful when it comes to different types of dashboards. Sometimes dashboards are meant to be displayed on a monitor 24/7, and if that's the case, it makes sense to just leave it at the default setting and leave it as a full screen experience. But if it's meant to be interacted by people, you can, of course, increase your rows and then allow them to scroll through as they see fit. Now, coming back to this filter, the way this works is pretty simple. So I'm going to go ahead and change the name here to, let's say, channel. And I'm going to create this, or I'm going to set this up as a channel filter. So I'm going to enable multi-select as well. So I'm going to allow my users to select more than one channel to view data on. I'll go ahead and once again go to meeting toolbars, blocking my view. All right, there we go. So set that to center, move the toolbar back down, and go to assign data. Okay, so what I'm going to set this up to do is filter the data based on the channel names. So I'll add that as my value. And now if I want to see what this does, I can click on preview at the top here. And you can see here the scrolling dashboard experience since I did add additional rows. I can go up to the top, choose a particular, let's go with organic versus paid. Let's see what that looks like. So you can see once I make these choices in the filter, all the widgets are updating within the dashboard, and they'll be specific to those particular channels. And one thing to note is that this data is being pulled from our sample database, so it may not be the fastest data source out there. There we go. So now you can see that all the visuals have changed, some of them pretty dramatically in terms of what they're showing because I've restricted the amount of data that I want to see. So now, for example, the donut chart and the combo chart are able to show quite a bit more data in a more, in a bigger format just because there's not as much data to be squished into these widgets. So the filters panels that you're able to include here are very powerful. And so in this case, I've only utilized one filter. We can have multiple filters, as many as we want, of different types. So I mentioned before that we can filter by dates. And so since we do have date fields associated with our data, we could include a date filter, which would allow us to filter by specific dates or date ranges. And another thing that's really powerful with regards to filtering is that you'll see here on the left side, we have 5 dedicated filter types: the list box, combo box, range slider, date picker, and range navigator. And so those are the main filter types you can add into your dashboard. But if you want to, you can actually utilize your actual widgets as filters as well. So there's a feature within Bold BI, and this is one of the few sort of advanced features I'll talk about in this particular webinar. We have others for the other features. One of those features is called Act as Master Widget. All of the widgets that display data have this option, and what this means is that you can go from 5 filters to over 30 types. Each widget can actually behave as a filter by checking that box. So what I've done is I've converted this stack area chart as a filter, and I haven't changed any of its settings. I haven't actually decided or specified what it will filter by. So let's actually go back to preview and see what it will do. So what I'm going to do now is click on a particular data point. So I'm going to look at clicks for the second quarter. And so essentially what's going to happen is it's going to be a two-pronged filter. So it will actually filter based on those values. So it's going to show me click data by that particular date range, the second quarter. So for any widgets that show click information, it will be restricted to that particular date time frame. And then anything else, so essentially it's going to restrict all the data to that specific time frame. And as you can see, all the widgets have now changed their values. So essentially the main value that was taken from that widget was the actual time frame and not so much the clicks themselves, because the click total is not being utilized as a filter value. So the interesting thing about that is I didn't have to change or set any values in order to tell it what to filter by. You can see here that the default filter value that was used is time frame here. Now, if you would like to specify what that is and have more control over it, you can. So if I go back, if I back out of this and close the preview, there is actually a filter panel that allows you to configure the behavior of filters within the dashboard. By default, as you've noticed, whenever you make a selection on a filter, the entire dashboard updates, and that includes other filters as well. It will restrict what data or values are available to you in other filters if you make a selection in a particular filter. You can change that behavior by clicking on the filter icon in the designer toolbar. And here you'll be able to see your different filters. So my dedicated drop-down menu, which is a specific filter type. And then down here, I have my graph. It also behaves and has the same settings as a dedicated filter. So what I have here is a list of all the widgets on the dashboard, and I can actually choose to have that filter affect them, or rather have those widgets listen to that filter. So if I don't want a specific widget to be affected by that, I can just uncheck it. And I can do the same thing for the actual graph. So here you can see the same thing, same listener widgets, but there's also this feature called filter profiles, which is what you see down here. So I can change the default profile and make it custom, and this is what allows me to change what value is utilized to affect the other widgets. So in this case, the only one that's appropriate for utilizing as a filter value is the date field. So the click data and the other data and the open data wouldn't really work as a filter value, so that's why I don't have other choices. But for other widgets where you have additional data values assigned to it, you can actually use these drop downs to select what piece of data from your widget will be used as a filter value. So you do actually have control over that behavior. And so I'm actually going to leave that at the default setting. I kind of like the way it works right now. And so now I've got a pretty satisfactory dashboard. Now, I mentioned earlier that the last piece here is to just make it your own. So once you've added data to any widget and you go back to your properties page, you'll notice that you have access to things like palette colors. So here, if I check this box, it will give me access to the individual colors being shown in that widget. So here you can see we have a very in-depth color picker system, so you can use these sliders to select a particular color. You can input your own RGB, hex, or HSVA values. So a lot of different ways that you can set up colors. If you have specific colors that you want to use, maybe company colors, company or corporate branding you need to use, you can easily implement that in any of your charts. So this will apply across the board. So any chart can be customized in this way. So the column charts, the stacked area charts, the combo charts, etc., they're going to have very similar controls for things like the color. So if I select that, I've selected the stacked area chart here, and so now I can go down and choose different colors for each of those areas. The one that's a little bit different on this particular demo is the gauge. So the gauge has quite a few settings for how it can look. So the first thing that I did, which you saw earlier, was change the type of gauge that it was from horseshoe to half circle. The other thing I can change here is the pointer look and feel. So what I want to do is have a range with a needle there like this, so that I can actually point to the specific value. And this is going to be useful for when I want to also show tick marks on the gauge, the actual gauge widget. So the tick marks are useful to show various points along the range. This is automatically set, and it actually the number of tick marks that you see will depend on the size of the gauge on the screen. So because right now it's fairly condensed because I have the properties panel open and I'm in the designer window, which also does sort of restrict the size available for each of the widgets, I only have a couple of tick marks showing. So once it goes into full preview mode or publish, you'll see more tick marks. But in addition to that, you can also customize where the tick marks appear. So inside or outside, which again will give you either more or less room to show additional tick marks. As you can see here, I actually have more now. You can change their height, their width. You can change things like, you can add additional ranges. So if I check that off, then you can see here that we can have ranges that can show things like good, bad, or neutral values, and you can customize those colors, of course. So various different control or widgets have different appearance controls available to them. Now again, going into some of those properties will be a bit more or a bit outside of the scope of this particular webinar, since we are trying to create a dashboard as quickly as possible. Now, within the first couple of minutes of me actually starting this webinar, I actually had already set up this dashboard. So it was really just a matter of dropping a widget on there, throwing some data into it, and that's it. At that point, it's ready to be published. From there, it's just a matter of how many widgets you need or want to have in your dashboard, and just how many data sources you're dealing with in order to decide or determine how long it's going to take you to create a dashboard. But hopefully, as you saw, it was a very quick and very easy process to throw something together that's fairly good looking, as well as extremely useful to your business or your enterprise. So naturally, you do have quite a bit of control over the look and feel, so all the colors can be changed, and as well as the different types of visualizations that you have for each of your data sets. Regarding some other features that we might have in Bold BI, so there are multiple ways to interact with widgets in addition to the linking, or sorry, the filtering that I showed you earlier. So the question was, can you actually click on a widget and have it take you somewhere else, like another page or another dashboard? And the answer is yes. So nearly all widgets support a feature that we call linking. So let's use this combo chart as the example. So I'll go into the properties for that. So click here, and once again, go to meetings in the way. All right. Okay, so when you're on the properties panel for a widget, you'll notice that there is a section called link. And so all you need to do is check the box called enable link. And what this allows you to do is generate a custom URL and use any of the information or any of the data fields from that widget to customize it. So let's say that this channel name corresponds to some term that maybe I'm not familiar with, or maybe it's something that I need to look up for whatever reason. So let's just try something simple here. So let's say that I just want to initiate a Google search based on that particular field. So all I need to do is type in my URL. I'm not actually sure if that's the correct way to do it, but let's just pretend. And then in this case, just double click the field name, and then we'll actually automatically place it into your URL. So when you click on it, this will actually be a completed URL. So we can actually go ahead and try this. I'm pretty sure that's incorrect, but if nothing else, it'll give us an error page on Google. So let's go ahead and go into preview mode. And now when I click on one of these columns, so let's click on campaign. There we go. So it brought us to Google, and you can see the URL was correctly formatted, although, however, that's not how you actually initiate a search from a URL on Google. So kind of get the idea of what you can do there. So some other use cases for that kind of feature include if you're using a grid, for example, and you have a list of, let's say, sales information. Let's say you're looking at invoices, a list of invoices that have come in, and the grid can only show so much. So you can only have so many columns in there, and let's say that you want to be able to click on each of those records and be taken to that specific document. So with the linking feature, you can do that. So let's say that your data set included the ID number of those invoices. You can create a custom URL that takes you to some web page that has that information, or potentially Bold Reports, which is able to do exactly that. Bold Reports is able to generate invoices, sales documents like receipts and things like that. You can directly link to any of those documents and utilize those ID numbers to pull up the correct document. So a lot of use cases for linking. There's a third way. So I just talked about two. There was the filtering, linking, and then a third way is drill down. So it looks like we actually already had a question asking if drill down is supported. And so yes, it is. And so that is the third way you can interact with any widget. So I can actually enable it here. I'm going to enable it here in the donut chart. So the way it works is you select your widget, you go to edit it. So go ahead and select it, go to the properties panel, go to meeting out of the way, and then click on assign data. So this is actually not done through the properties panel itself, but rather through assign data. And in this case, this is one of those widgets that has a column field for you to be able to set up. And all you need to do is add another column. So let's go from channel name down to, let's say, destination URL. When I do that, you'll see this message pops up asking if I want to enable multi-level drill down. So I'll say yes, and now that's turned on. So what'll happen now, I'm not actually sure what this will look like, but let's see. This is one of the features you can actually try out in the designer. You don't actually have to go into preview mode to test this out. So you can see visually that something is enabled now on this donut chart. That you can see that when I hover over the different segments, there's a little crosshatch pattern. And this is just indicating that I can click on a segment and something will happen. In this case, that something is drill down. So now we can see that this particular channel was sending people to these different URLs. And then we can see which ones were clicked more often. So we can have as many layers or as many columns as we want and a multi-level drill down enabled widget, so you can go down as far as you need to. As you go through the layers, you'll also be able to, this is probably not a good idea because it's probably too many dates, but as you go down through the layers, you'll notice that there's a little cookie trail along the top of the widget, so you can use that to go back between the layers. So that is supported on, again, pretty much all of the widgets. The one thing to note about these different interaction modes, the filtering, the linking, and the multi-level drill down, is that they are all activated the same way. They are all just left-click actions on that particular widget. And so what that means, and what you have to keep in mind, is that you cannot enable all three at the same time. You can only have one active at a time, because only one will be able to be activated at a time. Now, from a technical standpoint, it is possible for you to set up multi-level drill down like I did here, go back to properties, turn on linking, and turn on act as master widget. So you can actually check all the boxes, but only one of them will actually function. So just keep that in mind. So can the dashboards refresh or update themselves? And the answer, again, is yes. So there is an auto refresh setting within the dashboard designer. It's actually right next to the filter configuration panel that I showed earlier. So this little refresh looking icon is for refresh settings. So with this, you can enable refresh or auto refresh. You can set your interval. So you can see here, we can go down to 0. So essentially real-time or near real-time refreshes. And you can go up from there in increments of seconds, minutes, or hours. We also have the ability, similar to with the filters themselves, to only update specific widgets within the dashboard. So this way, you're able to make sure that you're not wasting any processing time or adding any additional loading time by trying to refresh widgets that may not need it. So for example, a lot of times it's not necessary to update your filters. A lot of times those filter values are just going to be pretty static. They're not really going to change over time. So it makes sense to uncheck those and not try to update those. And especially if you have a dashboard with multiple data sources, so that that could be a lot of different connections that need to be established all at once. So you have quite a bit of control over that. And then there's this third setting down here. So this actually corresponds to something I didn't talk about, but when it comes to data sources, you have the ability to set them up to auto refresh. So the data source itself can automatically be refreshed depending on its type. As an example, if you're connecting to a SQL database, like a Microsoft SQL database, you have the option to have Bold BI copy the contents of that data source to the Bold BI data store in order to alleviate stress on your data source. So if you have a lot of users, or maybe you have limited bandwidth, or just things like that, maybe for performance reasons, you want to not have a whole bunch of connections being made to your database, you can set Bold BI to handle it for you. When you do that, you get the option to also tell Bold BI to go back to that data source and refresh it on a schedule similar to this, but it's actually quite a bit more in depth, so you can actually specify the time of day and the number of recurrences and things like that within the data refresh. So if you set that up, this third checkbox, as you can see what it says, it will actually monitor the data and look for new data, so new records, or record that have been deleted, and if it finds any of those, it will automatically trigger a dashboard refresh as well. So it's a very powerful feature, especially when combined with the ability for dashboards to be shown on, again, on a monitor 24/7. They can just automatically refresh themselves either on their own interval or based on the data refresh itself. Also works really well with our slideshow feature, which allows you to string together multiple dashboards and again display them on a monitor and just have Bold BI automatically transition between them at some interval that you specify. All right, so again, if you have any questions, go ahead and throw them into the questions box. We've got a few minutes left in the hour in order to answer them. Let's see if we got anything else coming in. Okay, so a question coming in is, can you export data from dashboards? And the answer, of course, is yes. You can actually kind of see it already on the screen right now. So there are some settings for it that you see here. So you can actually control this in multiple different levels. So on a per widget basis, you can actually control what formats can be exported from those widgets, and even including turning off the ability to export. So if you have security concerns, you don't want users being able to export data from your dashboards, you can turn this off or just restrict it to specific exports. So for example, You can restrict it to just image or PDF if you do not want your users to be able to export the raw data, which would come from the CSV or Excel export options. This is specific to the individual widgets. We can also export data on a dashboard level. So I'm actually going to back out here and open up a created dashboard. And when you've published a dashboard, you actually have access to some additional features, and exporting is one of them. So on a fully published dashboard, there's a toolbar along the top of the page that will allow you to export the whole dashboard as well as access a couple of other features. So let's just do this one right here. Okay, so you see that we've got a dashboard loaded up. This is a published one, so we don't have the designer interface naturally. And so over here in the options menu item, we have the ability to manually refresh, get a link, or export. And so this export is different than the one we saw earlier. This is specific to the entire dashboard. And then the one that we saw earlier corresponds to individual widgets. So if you click the options menu for a particular widget, then you see the 4 options you saw earlier that corresponded to those checkboxes. So you can turn it off at the widget level, and you can also turn exporting off at the dashboard level. So again, quite a bit of control over how your data is managed. And again, if you have any questions, just let us know. You can find us on social media. So if you have an additional question that you didn't get a chance to ask today, reach out to us on Twitter, LinkedIn, or Facebook, and we'll be happy to answer anything you might have. And with that, I thank you for your time today and hope to see you in the next one.